A wooden beam crashed down into the mud. Splinters flew. A small hand pushed up from beneath the wreckage. Then a voice. Thin, cracked, barely human anymore. Please, don't leave us. A boot stopped at the edge of the rubble. Heavy, mud-caked. The boot belonged to a man who had killed more enemies than most men ever meet. Behind him, a black wolf stood frozen, ears flat. A storm rolled in the distance. Rain hissed against scorched wood. The man knelt. Slow, careful. His gloved hand pulled away a broken plank. Underneath, two children. A boy holding a girl. Both shaking. Both barely breathing. The boy looked up and recognized the silver crest on his cloak. The Alpha King. The most feared man in 7 territories. What this king did next would unmake every law his kingdom had ever held sacred. Stay with me on this one. He lifted the boy first. The child weighed almost nothing. The girl came next, wrapped in what was left of a wool blanket. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were closed. The king did not speak. He did not need to. The black wolf at his side took 2 slow steps closer and lowered its great head. It sniffed the children. Once, twice. Then it did something the warrior beside it had never seen in 15 years of service. The wolf let out a low, soft sound. Not a growl. Almost a hum. That sound meant one thing in the old tongue. Mine. A second man emerged from the tree line. Tall, lean, a long scar across his jaw. This was Bryn, the king's scout and oldest companion. Bryn had ridden with the king through 3 border wars and a winter that had killed half the army. He had seen the king kill men with his bare hands. He had never seen him kneel for anyone. He stopped at the edge of the burnt-out hut and stared. Kalen, Bryn said quietly. Sire, you know what they are. The king said nothing. You know the law. The king lifted the girl higher against his chest. Her head fell against his shoulder. She murmured something in her sleep. One small hand curled into the fur lining of his cloak. Kalen, I know the law, the king said. Now here's the thing about that law. In the kingdom of Vale, the Alpha King ruled over 6 wolf clans and 1,000 miles of forest. He was the strongest, the oldest of his line, a born shifter, and his throne stood on a single brutal rule called the Severing Law. The Severing Law said this. Any child born from a banished bloodline was to be left where it fell. No mercy, no shelter, no kindness. To take such a child in was to declare yourself an enemy of the kingdom itself. These 2 children in this collapsed hut were the last of the Aaron line. Banished 4 generations ago. Believed extinct. Until tonight. The hut had not collapsed by accident. A raid had passed through this valley in the dark hours. Shadowclaw raiders, lean men from the eastern wastes, hunting any sign of the old Aaron blood. The hut had been struck. The children's mother had not survived. Bryn had counted 3 bodies in the rubble already. Only these 2 had crawled out. Only these 2 had whispered, please, don't leave us when Boots came near. And the man whose boots they had whispered to was the very man whose law condemned them. Kalen turned to his wolf. The wolf lowered itself to the ground. The king set the boy on its back and held the girl tight in his own arm. Sire, Bryn said again, if we ride them to the keep, the council will know by sundown. Lord Marek will know. The High Speaker will know. Let them know. Kalen, Bryn lowered his voice. The High Speaker can call the hounds. The king's jaw tightened. Just a flicker. Then nothing. He swung up onto the wolf's back behind the boy. Then we ride faster. Believe me when I tell you, no one had said the word hounds in front of the king for 10 years. The hounds were not men. They were not wolves. They were something older. Something the kingdom had built to enforce its harshest laws, when even the king might be tempted to break them. A king could overrule his council. A king could overrule his army. A king could not overrule the hounds. The boy looked up at Kalen. His face was streaked with soot and tears. He could not have been more than 8 years old. "Are you going to leave us?" he asked. The king looked down at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "I am not." The girl shifted in his arm. She mumbled into his cloak. "Promise." He did not answer with words. He pulled his cloak tighter around her. The silver crest at his throat caught the last gray light of evening. That crest was the symbol of his crown. The same crown that had drafted the severing law into stone 400 years ago. The black wolf rose with all 3 of them on its back and turned toward the stronghold of Greyhall. Behind them, the rain finally came down hard. The collapsed hut hissed as fire and water met. Bryn watched them ride away. He stood in the rubble for a long time. Then he climbed onto his own mount and followed his king into a war that had not yet begun. Greyhall sat on a ridge of black stone. 4 towers. 1 iron gate. A small chapel built into the eastern wall 100 years before the keep itself. The ride took 2 hours through wet forest. Kalen did not slow once. When they came through the gate, every man in the courtyard stopped what he was doing. Stable boys. Soldiers. A blacksmith with a hammer halfway through a swing. They all stared. The Alpha King did not return alone. He returned with 2 children pressed against him. He carried the girl up the chapel steps himself. Bryn carried the boy. The chapel was small and old, but it had thick walls and only 1 door, and Kalen knew his guards could hold 1 door for a long time. He laid the girl down on a wool pallet. Bryn set the boy beside her. The 2 children clung together immediately. The boy's hand found his sister's hand and would not let go. A young woman, the keep's healer, knelt beside them. Her name was Essa. She glanced up at the king with wide eyes. "Sire, these are wards of the throne," the king said. "Treat them so." Essa's mouth opened. It closed. She nodded once and got to work. Now here is where it turned. It had taken less than an hour for word to reach the High Council. A raven had gone up the moment Kalen had ridden through Greyhall's gate. By midnight, a council messenger stood in the courtyard. He wore the gray robe of the High Speaker's order. He carried a sealed scroll in one hand and a long staff of white wood in the other. He did not bow. That alone was a declaration of war. Kalen came down to meet him. He had not changed his clothes. There was still mud on his boots. There was still blood on his sleeves, some of it the children's, some of it not. The messenger spoke loud enough for the courtyard to hear. He intended that. The High Speaker had sent him to speak loud. By the severing law of Vale, in the 402nd year of the crown, a king of this realm has sheltered the cursed line of Aaron within his walls. The High Council demands the immediate surrender of these children to the order, for the carrying out of the law as it is written. Every man in the courtyard heard it. Every man went still. Kalen looked at the messenger for a long moment. The wind moved his cloak. The silver crest at his throat caught the torchlight. He did not raise his voice. "I refuse." 2 words. That was all. The messenger's face changed. He had expected anger. He had expected a king to roar. He had not expected this calm. "Sire, you understand what you have just said. I understand it perfectly. I claim those children as wards of the throne. They are under my protection. Anyone who lifts a hand against them lifts a hand against me. The messenger's grip tightened on his white staff. The severing law cannot be set aside by any king. Not even you. I just set it aside. The messenger took a step back. He looked around the courtyard. Soldiers, stable boys, the blacksmith. Every face was watching the king. Some were stunned. Some were afraid. Just a few, were smiling. Then I will carry your answer to the High Speaker, the messenger said. His voice shook. And the High Speaker will carry it where it must be carried. Carry it where you like. The messenger turned and rode out into the night. Bryn came up beside the king. He spoke low so only Kaelen could hear. You just declared war on your own crown. I know. They will call the hounds, Kaelen. You know they will. Let them try. But here is what no one in the courtyard saw. After the messenger had gone, after the gate was barred again, after the soldiers had returned to their posts, the king went back up to the chapel. He carried a small wooden bowl in one hand and a cloth-wrapped loaf in the other. Warm bread. A bowl of milk with honey stirred into it. The boy was sitting up on the pallet now, watching the door. When Kaelen came in, the boy flinched. The king set the bowl down. He sat on the floor across from the children. Not on the bench. The floor. So he was no taller than they were. He pulled the cloth back from the bread. He broke off a piece. He held it out to the boy. The boy took it slowly. The girl was awake now. She watched everything with huge dark eyes. The king broke off another piece and held it out to her. She took it the same way her brother had. Slow, careful, as if she expected the bread to be taken back. It was not taken back. For a long time, the only sound in that chapel was 3 people eating bread. Then the girl crawled across the floor. She climbed into the king's lap. She put her head against his chest, exactly where the silver crest hung. She closed her eyes. The boy watched her do it. He did not move at first. Then he came over too. He did not climb into the king's lap. He sat against the king's side, his small shoulder pressed against the king's arm, and he stayed there. Kaelen did not move. He hardly breathed. The candles burned low. The wind died down outside. The keep settled. For the first time in his entire reign, the Alpha King thought perhaps that this could be done. That he could hold this small thing against the weight of everything around him. That maybe the council would shout and the law would crack and the kingdom would shake, but he could hold this. He even smiled. Just a small one. Just a quiet one. He thought it was over. It was not. A whisper at the chapel door. Sire. Bryn stood in the doorway. His face was the color of ash. They've sent the hounds. That was the trigger. 3 words. The conflict changed completely. Kaelen went still. The girl was still asleep against his chest. The boy was still pressed against his side. He did not want to move them. He did not want to wake them. He wanted to sit in this chapel for the rest of his life. He could not. How many? The king asked. 3. Maybe 4. Riding hard from the spires. They will be here before dawn. Now here is what you have to understand about the hounds. They were not soldiers. They were not assassins for hire. The hounds were forged. Long ago, when the kingdom was young, the first High Speaker had taken 5 great warriors and bound them to the laws themselves. They were no longer men. They could not be killed by any common steel. They could not be reasoned with. They could not be commanded by a king. They were the law walking. If the severing law had been broken, the hounds would come for the breaker. Not for the children. For him. Kaelen stood up slowly. The girl murmured. He laid her gently on the pallet beside her brother. He put his cloak over both of them. The silver crest fell against the wool. He looked down at the two small bodies for a long moment. Then he walked out of the chapel and pulled the door shut behind him. In the corridor he spoke fast. "Bryn, get the children below. The old root cellar under the eastern tower. No torches. No guards. Essa goes with them and no one else. Sire, you can't fight hounds alone. I am not going to fight them in the keep. I am going to meet them at the chapel doors. Outside. In the open. Where the children cannot be touched." Bryn did not argue. He had ridden with this king for 15 years. He knew that voice. The hounds came 2 hours before dawn. There were 4 of them, just as Bryn had feared. They wore long black coats. Their faces were covered with iron half-masks. Each one carried a curved blade, and each blade glowed faintly with a pale light. That light was the law itself, given a shape that could cut. Kalen stood alone at the top of the chapel steps. No armor. No crown. Just a sword, his cloak, and the silver crest at his throat. The first hound climbed the steps. It did not speak. Hounds did not speak. It only raised its blade. Kalen moved. I am not going to make this longer than it was. It was short. It was brutal. The King of Vale was not a young man, but he was an alpha shifter at the height of his strength, and he had not survived 3 border wars by being slow. The hound swung. Kalen caught the blade on his own. He twisted. The hound's mask cracked. Kalen drove his sword up under the iron and threw. The hound fell. It did not bleed like a man. It poured pale light onto the stone steps. Then the light went out. The other 3 hounds stopped at the foot of the steps. They had not expected this. The law had told them the Kingbreaker would be alone and tired and afraid. The law had been wrong. Kalen walked down the steps with his sword still in his hand. "Tell your master," he said, "that the next one I kill I send back in pieces." The 3 remaining hounds turned in unison and rode out of Greyhall without a word. This was the first payoff. The first real one. The Alpha King had killed a hound. No King of Vale had ever killed a hound. No king had ever needed to. Now, before we go any further, if you've made it this far into the story and you want to see how it ends, hit that subscribe button down below. It costs you nothing, and it tells me you want more stories like this one. Then stay with me. Because what comes next changes everything. Kalen came back into the keep. He was breathing hard. There was hound light on his sleeves. It glowed for a few seconds and then faded. Bryn met him in the corridor. So did Essa, the healer. Her hands were shaking. "Sire," Essa said, "there is something you need to see." She led him down to the root cellar. The children were sitting on a folded blanket in the corner. The boy looked up. The girl held her wrist out. Essa had pulled the sleeve of the girl's small dress up past her elbow. On the inside of her wrist, just above the pulse, was a mark. It was the shape of a thin crescent moon, surrounded by 7 small dots. The mark was not painted. It was not a tattoo. It glowed very faintly, with the same pale silver as the king's crest. Kalen went down on one knee. He looked at that mark for a long time. "Sire," Essa whispered. "Is that?" "Yes. But that line was extinct," the king finished. "Yes. So we were told." He looked up at Bryn. "This is why the Arryn line was banished. Not because they were dangerous. Because they were Moonborn. Because if a Moonborn ever stood beside a king again, every law the High Speaker built would crack." Bryn stared at the girl. The girl stared back. She did not understand any of it. She only knew that the man with the silver crest had given her bread, and had not left her, and had killed something terrible at the door so that she could keep sleeping. Sire Bryn said, "If the High Speaker knows what she is, he knows, then he will not send hounds again. No, he will come himself, and he will bring everything he has." The king stood up. He looked at the boy. He looked at the girl with the silver mark. "Then we ride at dawn for the stone spires," he said. "We end this where the law was made, or it ends us. Now this is where it turns for good." The stone spires were the oldest place in the kingdom. Older than the throne. Older than the severing law. They were a circle of 7 black pillars on a high plateau, and according to the oldest stories, every law of Vale had been spoken into stone there. If a law was going to be broken, it had to be broken at the spires. Anywhere else, and the hounds would come back forever. Kaelin rode at the head of his column at first light. The 2 children rode with him on the great black wolf. Bryn rode at his right. Essa rode at his left. Behind them on paper was the Alpha King's army. In practice, the army was not what it had been the day before. Word of the severing law-breaking had spread overnight. By morning, 2 of his 6 clan lords had pulled their banners from his column. They had ridden home and locked their gates. 3 more had stayed in their halls and sent only token forces. Only 1 clan lord, an old wolf named Torvin, had ridden out with his full strength. So the Alpha King rode toward the stone spires with maybe 300 men, where there should have been 3,000. He did not look back once. The High Speaker was already there. He stood at the center of the 7 pillars, dressed in white, holding the long white staff of his office. Behind him stood the 3 remaining hounds. And behind the hounds stood every clan lord who had refused to ride with the king. That was the thing the High Speaker had managed in a single night. He had made the king's enemies into a single line. Kaelin dismounted. He walked alone into the center of the circle. The High Speaker raised his staff. "Kaelin Vor, Alpha King of Vale, by the severing law, you have sheltered the cursed Aaron line within your walls. By the laws of this circle, your crown is forfeit. Lay it down." Kaelin stopped 10 paces from him. "No. Then there is only one ending to this." "There is." The High Speaker brought his staff down on the stone. The crack was like a tree splitting. The 3 hounds stepped forward. What happened next, I am going to tell you exactly as it happened. The hounds came at the king from 3 sides. Bryn shouted and charged in from the column. Torvin, the old gray wolf clan lord, shifted on the run, his great form crashing into the line of refusing clan lords, breaking it. Essa pulled the children behind one of the pillars and shielded them with her own body. Kaelin met the first hound and took its blade across his ribs. He kept moving. He drove his sword into the second hound's mask. Pale light burst out across the stone. The hound dropped. The third hound caught him from behind. Its blade went through his shoulder. Kaelin went down on one knee. The High Speaker raised his staff. His voice was triumphant. "The law holds." And then the girl walked out from behind the pillar. She was small. Her feet were bare. Her dark hair was tangled. She still had soot on her face from the collapsed hut. She walked across the stone toward Kaelin, and she did not look at the High Speaker once. She knelt beside the king. She put her small hand on his bleeding shoulder. The mark on her wrist began to glow. The boy came out next. He stood behind her, his small hand on her shoulder, the way she had held his hand in the rubble. Whatever bond their broken little family still had between them, they put it into that touch. The mark on her wrist flared bright as a moon. Silver light poured out of her. Out of the stone under her. Out of the 7 pillars. The third hound staggered. It dropped to its knees. Believe me, no one in that circle was breathing. The light filled the air. It washed over Kalen. The wound in his shoulder closed. The cut across his ribs sealed. He stood up slowly. He looked down at the girl. She looked up at him. She was crying. She did not know what she had done. "It's all right," he said quietly. "It's all right, little one." The high speaker made a sound that was not quite a word. "Moonborn," he whispered. "She is." "Yes," Kalen said. "She is." The remaining hound was still on its knees. It lifted its iron-masked face. And then slowly, it lowered that face to the stone. It pressed its forehead to the ground in front of the girl. The pale glow on its blade went out. A small iron collar around its neck cracked and fell to the stone in 2 pieces. The hound was no longer a hound. The law had let it go. The high speaker's hand shook on his staff. This is impossible." "It is law," Kalen said. "Older than yours." He turned to the line of clan lords standing behind the high speaker. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Choose." One by one, those clan lords stepped forward and bent the knee. Some quickly, some slowly. 1 or 2 not at all. The ones who did not, Torvin and Bryn, rode down before the sun rose any higher. The high speaker stood alone in the center of his broken circle. He looked at the king, at the moonborn girl, at the boy with his hand on her shoulder. He looked at the hound bowing at her feet. He did the only thing left to him. He laid his staff down on the stone. He stepped back. He walked away into the morning, and he was never seen in the kingdom of Vale again. The Alpha King knelt and picked up both children at once. The girl in his right arm. The boy in his left. The black wolf came up the slope to him. It lowered its great head against the boy's small forehead. "Mine," the wolf hummed again. "Mine." Now here is what happened in the days that followed. The kingdom did not break apart, not the way the high speaker had promised it would. But it did change. You could feel it on the roads. You could feel it in the halls. The severing law had stood for 400 years. It was gone in a single morning. And when a thing that old goes, everything that grew up around it has to find a new shape. Kalen rode back to Greyhall with the children. The cloak with the silver crest hung loose on his shoulders. The old crest still meant the same thing, but it meant it differently now. The crown of Vale had once been the crown that wrote the severing law. Now it was the crown that had broken it. Same crest. Different king. Within a week, every clan lord in the kingdom had to make a choice. Some came to Greyhall and bent the knee in person. Some sent envoys. A few held out and pretended nothing had changed, but they were old men, and the world had moved without them, and they knew it. Torvin, the old gray wolf, was given a seat at the king's right hand for the rest of his days. Bryn was given the keys to the eastern keep. Essa, the young healer, was made the children's keeper. She was the closest thing the girl had to a mother now, and she took that the way she took everything else, with quiet hands and a steady voice. The boy's name was Aaron. The girl's name was Lyra. Kalen had not asked them their names that first night in the chapel. He had not wanted to push them. They told him on the 3rd day, of their own choosing, while sitting on the chapel steps eating apples. He repeated their names back to them carefully, as if he wanted to be sure he had them right. He did. For the rest of his life, he had them right. Now I have to tell you about the part of this that I think matters the most. The hound. The one that bowed in the circle. The one whose iron collar cracked in 2. That creature was no longer a hound. It was no longer the law walking. It was something else. A man almost. A very old, very tired man, who had been bound to a single duty for so long that he had forgotten he had ever been anything else. When Kaelin asked him his name, he had to think for a long time before he could remember it. He took the name back slowly, like a man learning to walk again. He did not return to the spires. He stayed at Greyhall. He sat in the courtyard most days in the sun, and he watched the children play. The girl, Lyra, was the only one who could make him smile. He never told anyone why. One spring morning, 3 months after the night the hut had collapsed, Kaelin rode back to that valley. He brought Aaron and Lyra with him. He brought Bryn. He brought a small wooden box. The hut was just rubble now. The grass had grown through it. The fire smell was long gone. Kaelin knelt where the door had been. He scraped a small hole in the earth with his hands. He opened the wooden box. Inside was a sapling. A young oak. No taller than the girl's knee. Aaron took it out carefully. Lyra held the soil. Together, the two of them, the way they had held each other under the broken beams, planted that sapling in the place where their mother had died. Kaelin stood back. He let them do it themselves. The black wolf lay in the grass beside them and did not move. When they were done, Lyra came over to Kaelin and tugged at his cloak. "Will you stay with us?" she asked. "Always." Bryn looked away. He had to. Kaelin went down on one knee in the grass. He brushed a strand of hair out of her face. "Yes," he said. "Always." "Promise," she said. "I promise." Aaron came over too. He did not say anything. He did not need to. He just leaned against the king's side, the same way he had in the chapel that first night, and the king put his arm around him, and they all stayed like that for a long time in the quiet of that valley. The black wolf got up eventually and walked over and put its great head against Lyra's shoulder. She put her small hand on its muzzle. "Mine," she whispered, in a voice so soft that almost no one heard. The wolf hummed back. "Mine." That was the answer to the plea from the collapsed hut. Not a speech. Not a law. Not a war. Just a man on one knee in the grass, with 2 children leaning against him, and a black wolf at their feet, and the smell of new earth in the air. The Alpha King had broken the oldest law of his kingdom. He had brought down the severing law. He had killed a hound, and he had unmade a high speaker, and he had reordered everything that the kingdom thought it understood about the man on the throne. But he would tell you, if you asked him, that none of those were the real moment. The real moment had come before any of it. The real moment had come when a small voice under broken beams had said, "Please, don't leave us," and a man who had been raised to leave them anyway had lifted away the first plank. The rest of his reign just followed from that. And in that valley, every spring after, an oak grew taller. And every spring after, a king and 2 children came back to sit beneath it. And no one in the kingdom of Vale ever asked again what kind of king they had. They knew.